you see this button? My mouse doesn't even have to be on it to click it. Now look at this Celeste clip. How is the character still able to jump while being so far away from the cliff edge? And finally, how in the world did that guy survive that? Now all of these clips may seem very disconnected, but they all share something in common. And that's the fact that what you're seeing on the screen is not what's being calculated in code. So why are the visuals lying to you? Well, that would be because of hitboxes. Hitboxes are basically invisible shapes in the code that tell the game where an object actually is. But most of the time, the visuals in the hitboxes don't align. But there is a good reason for this. So today, I'll give you the best examples of when visuals and hitboxes don't align, and why game developers actually do this on purpose to make the game better, or worse, for the player. When I click, this button is being activated, but visually, my mouse isn't even on the button. That's because, just like every other interactable object in a game, this button is an invisible hitbox my mouse is currently interacting with. But why would game developers not make the button the same size as the hitbox? Well, if you were to do that, clicking the button would become extremely frustrating. This is because you would constantly be trying to click a pixel-perfect button. But when a button's hitbox is bigger than the actual button, the area that can be clicked becomes much larger, and of course easier to click. And that means our brains don't have to be as precise when we're trying to click the button, and that means we'll almost never miss the click. Now here, the player is clearly off of the edge of the cliff, but we can still jump. Like our last example, the player here still has an invisible hitbox that's essentially telling the game where they are in the world. But this time, the hitbox is also off of the cliff, so what is going on here? What game developers have realized is that making a pixel-perfect jump off of a cliff is extremely difficult and therefore extremely frustrating for players. Think about it, if you had to make a pixel-perfect jump as you're going off the side of a cliff, the game would feel stiff and impossible. So what they've done is instead, you have a couple frames when you jump off a cliff to still perform your jump. This is what we call a coyote jump in game development. So what the game does is it waits for the player's hitbox to leave the cliff. And then after that, they give the player about 10 frames to still be able to perform a jump once the hitbox has left the cliff. So now instead of the game feeling stiff and difficult, the game now feels smooth and manageable. Okay, but I hear you now. Why would the Super Smash Bros. Developers let Shulk miss a hit like that? There cannot be a good reason for it. Well, you'd be correct, and the reason that can happen is because of a bug in the hitbox. Now to understand this bug, you have to understand that Super Smash Bros. Ultimate was a game that is made in a 3D game engine for what is essentially a 2D game. So with that understood, check this out. Shulk's hitboxes on this attack are actually misaligned, and when we look at it from the top, you can actually see that Shulk's attack has a blind spot right in front of him, because of the fact that the hitboxes are misaligned. So while hitboxes, like in our last examples, can make games easier and more manageable, they can still cause a lot of problems. And Dark Souls is no exception to that rule. Dark Souls, like every other game we've talked about so far, has hitboxes that are attached to their enemies and their attacks. Now when an enemy attacks, there's a hitbox on their weapon, and as they attack, that hitbox on the weapon activates. When that attack is done, the game is supposed to deactivate that hitbox attached to the weapon. Dark Souls is unfortunately bugged, so what you get is some fights where a boss's weapon doesn't deactivate the moment it should, and so instead you get a weapon hitbox that should have been deactivated, but instead lingers around. This is promptly named lingering hitboxes, which means even though an attack may be done and the weapon may be sitting still, if a player is unfortunate enough to run into the weapon during this lingering hitbox moment, the player can still take damage. And as you would expect, this is an extremely frustrating bug in the hitboxes. But in a tight platformer like Cuphead, the game could really not afford to have bugged hitboxes like in Dark Souls, because Cuphead is really a game about dodging and weaving, which is why the hitbox for the Cuphead character is way smaller than the visual representation of the Cuphead character. And again, this all plays into players' frustration, because if the Cuphead player's hitbox was the same size as the visual representation of the character, players on such a small screen wouldn't be able to dodge anything. The game wouldn't be just frustrating, it would be impossible. But with that small hitbox, the game feels possible and the dodging feels precise. Now, hitboxes don't have to just serve the purpose where they curb a player's frustrations or make a game worse for players. They actually allow game developers to add cool features to a game. Like in Tomb Raider, you can reach the top of a cliff when you really shouldn't be able to visually. Because in Tomb Raider, if you jump close enough to the edge of a cliff, the game will run a calculation, and if your hitbox is close enough to that cliff edge, the game will yank you up there. And that's really only possible in the code through the use of a hitbox. So while other games may use hitboxes to keep a player's frustration down, Tomb Raiders actually used hitboxes to make an extra mechanic that made exploration way more enjoyable. By now, you should be picking up on the fact that hitboxes are drastically different than what you're seeing on the screen, and that hitboxes serve an extremely important purpose. And so before I end this video, I want to leave you with a couple general but important notes about hitboxes. Firstly, hitboxes are a part of any game that has collision, movement, or interactions between players. Secondly, it's worth noting that hitboxes are constantly updated throughout a game's lifecycle, and they really do this to avoid the problems we talked about earlier. But it's also why after some updates, the game might feel different than how it used to. Counter-Strike, as a great example, has made tons of updates to its hitboxes for, various reasons, but it's why the game sometimes feels different after an update. Finally, there is a reason hitboxes act the way they act. And ultimately, it's because developers are not in the business of making hitboxes match up perfectly with their visual counterparts. At the end of the day, game developers are laser focused on making sure a game feels good, making sure a game plays well, and making sure a game is fun. Game developers don't really care if a hitbox is pixel perfect, and for the reasons I've explained, most of the time they usually try to avoid that, for the betterment of you, the player. So yes, it is the Super Smash Bros. Developers' fault that you missed that down smash. You should totally go bother them on Twitter. But in all seriousness, I hope you enjoyed this video, and hope you have a great rest of your day. I'm out.